To get started here. Hi everyone, I'm Nina Sachdev. I'm the Communications Director for Media Impact Funders. And I'm pleased to welcome you to our second collaborative webinar with PACE Funders on rebuilding public trust. If you were unable to join us for the first installment back in December, we'll put the link to the recording in the chat box, which you can find on the bottom of your Zoom screen. That webinar featured a discussion about America's public square and how a combination of economic changes, advances in technology, and more are reshaping how we access and engage with the information that connects us to civic life. The conversation was led by Kristen Campbell, the Executive Director of PACE, or Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement, which is a community of funders who invest in initiatives that support and strengthen democracy. So there is no greater partner to facilitate this discussion than PACE. For those who were able to participate in that webinar, welcome back. And thanks again to Kristen, who's back in the driver's seat today. Today, Kristen will be leading us in a conversation with some really great speakers about journalism's role in fostering productive dialogue online, how we create the conditions that allow for that meaningful discussion, and how philanthropy can help support that work. So thank you, Kristen, for your expertise and for joining us today on the coldest day on Earth, depending on where you are. But before we turn to that, I just want to add a couple notes about your webinar experience. If at any time you have a question, there's a Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. Type in your question and Kristen will make sure we get them addressed. We encourage you to ask questions to all of our speakers today because even though we can't see you, we want to be able to hear your thoughts and insights. So with that, I will turn it over to Kristen. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you, Nina, and also special thanks to our colleagues Roshni and Ariel for all of your coordination in making today's discussion possible. What brings us into, at PACE, what brings us into this conversation is a paper that we re-released in 2018 called Infogagement, which is a term that was coined to describe the collision between the fields of media, technology, and civic engagement. We were inspired into this exploration by several of our members who were working in various aspects of those fields and had a premonition that those fields would soon collide. It turns out that they were onto something. The paper was originally released back in 2014 and started to unpack some of those collision course factors that were emerging. And as we all know, which is why we're interested in discussions like this, we've been living in the wake of that collision for some time now, which is what inspired us to re-release the paper and update it for a 2018 or current day context. I guess we're in 2019 now, but I think most of it still applies. The re-release included some fresh perspectives from leaders across the field, two of whom are with us today. I just want to take a quick moment to say that I'm really appreciative of the partnership with MIF, Media Impact Funders, to advance this dialogue. As Nina mentioned, this is the second webinar that we're co-hosting on themes of infogagement, and we really hope that together these conversations will help identify other opportunities through which our institutions can collaborate to support the thinking and practice of our members and others who exist across the field of philanthropy. So today, we're here to think together about the ways that dialogue and discourse have evolved online in the age of infogagement. On one hand, social media platforms have created space for citizens to have a voice, engage with one another, and create change in ways that once felt pretty unimaginable to a lot of us. And those platforms have also served as a bridge to civic access for many people. But of course, those same tools have also given way to the spread of disinformation and to deepening polarization and division. And so the theme of trust was something that was really persistent through a lot of conversations that we had in the course of our work, and especially through the evolution of the Infogagement exploration. As trust in our democratic institution falls and our public square evolves so rapidly, we have to find new and old ways, refining old ways to better bring people together. And that's what we're here to explore today. So I'm thankful to have the help in that exploration from our lovely speakers today. I'm really pleased and honored to have with us Kelly Bourne, who is a program officer on the Madison initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Jenny Choi, Director of Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York, and Talia Stroud, Associate Professor in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. As an Oklahoman, I am obligated to note that I'm from Oklahoma when referencing anything about Texas, so I will refrain from further commenting and just leave that there. But we will begin with a short dialogue with Kelly and Jenny, digging into the ways in which social media and journalism intersect with democracy and civic participation. And then we're going to hear from Talia about some of her research in this space, in particular, delving into some of the solutions, potential solutions to address some of the challenges that we face. So with that, I'd love to just jump into the discussion. Kelly, I would love to start with you. In your essay contribution to the Infogagement refresh and in your work with the Madison initiative, you think a lot about how social media is shifting the landscape of civic engagement and democracy. While that continues to be true, it's also true that these platforms were not actually built with civic engagement or civil dialogue as an objective. And so can you speak a little bit to what that kind of mismatch between original design intent and how folks are actually using these platforms today means and looks like for our work and for this conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. And I just realized this is my first WANL ever. I didn't notice it until looking at the speaker. It's all women for the first time ever. I'm so thrilled. So I don't know if anybody noticed it. Yeah, so I pulled together a couple quick slides because I think this is a field that is evolving incredibly quickly. I mean, just a couple of years ago, no one had ever really heard the term fake news, and disinformation wasn't really part of the common dialogue, and it's an area that is changing quite quickly. And so one of the things that we have done at Hewlett really is to support data to better understand the problem out of a concern that it is that we as a society are moving really, really quickly towards policy solutions without even really first fully understanding the problem. So I think, as you mentioned, Kristen, so I'll talk a little bit about the problem, and then I know Jenny's going to turn to journalism and Talia to talk about tech platforms. But to your question about how social media is impacting civic engagement and how that has evolved, I think this screen to me says it all. It's fascinating because this is a screenshot of two different articles coming from the same department at Stanford University 4 years apart. So in the first one, Larry Diamond puts forth this concept of liberation technology, looking at the Arab Spring, looking at how platforms have, to Kristen, to your point, helped to elevate free speech and minority voices and allow for civic engagement to be organized online and then translating to the offline realm, and in many instances helping to support protests against authoritarian regimes. So a very pro-democratic conception of this technology. And then cut to 4 years later, same department at Stanford puts forth this article, Can Democracy Survive the Internet? And really elevating concerns around trolling and doxing and flooding, bots, micro-targeting, foreign interference. And mind you, these are the same technologies, but I think, introduced into very different geopolitical contexts. And also, even looking at Twitter versus Google versus Facebook, each elevating very different kinds of content given their algorithms. So, but I think this screen really encapsulates for me how the problem of modern technology really pits two core democratic values in tension, right? On the one hand, we want to elevate minority voices and enable free speech and facilitate easier civic organizing. But on the other hand, we really want a well and accurately informed citizenry that is engaging in a civil way. And so you have these two core democratic values kind of in tension. And what we have then done, as I noted, is really started to support research out of a concern that so little is known about the problem. And until we really understand both the harms and the benefits of this technology better, we're going to end up with interventions that might not solve the problem we're concerned about and might create some other problems along the way. So I'll just go quickly through a few things that we do know. Obviously, everyone's seen the slides on declining trust in news media, particularly pronounced amongst Republicans. I think something like only 14% of Republicans believe that media reports things accurately versus 62% of Democrats. So big declines here. What's interesting to me to see is how strong the correlation is between trust in government and satisfaction with or trust in media. And this is a trend that you see around the world with a very, very strong correlation there. But what I noticed is that in many of these conversations, that social media is often sort of blamed for having contributed to a decline in trust in media or rising polarization or declining trust in government. All of those trends really preceded the introduction of social. But what it is clear is that they have contributed to declining journalistic revenue models, have helped to enable greater foreign interference, concerns around attention overload, increased incivility. So some things they are responsible for and some things that they may be contributing to but probably didn't cause. So I think it's really interesting to look in particular at social media, what it is doing, what it is not doing, and how it fits into this broader media landscape. So I'm going to just go through three things before turning it over to Jenny, talk about the sources of news in Americans' political diets and the role of social media and of disinformation in particular, and then going deeper into disinformation, how are people engaging with it, what impact is that having, because I think understanding that has really important implications for how we think about solving the problem or how we even define the problem itself. So looking at sources of news, right? So we hear a lot that 70% of people are now getting their news on social. But I think it's important to note that only 7 or 8% of people actually say that that is a primary source of news for them. Most people are still getting the majority of their media from the mainstream news media. And Facebook recently disclosed that only about 4% of an average user's news feed is comprised of actual news. I mean, most of it is baby pictures and you know, Kardashian stuff or whatever. So it is still a relatively small percentage of most people's media diet. That said, given how Trump uses Twitter, it is often a source for mainstream news. And so it's sort of hard to untangle that. Now looking at disinformation in particular, and where is that coming from? It was really revelatory for me to appreciate that if you took like the top 100 fake news sites in the country, 40% of the traffic to those sites is coming from people texting it to their friends, emailing it to their friends, looking it up themselves on Google search. Only 60% is coming from direct traffic from social media. So even if we got rid of social media entirely, it wouldn't necessarily solve this disinformation or fake news problem, although it would significantly curb parts of it. The other thing that is given a lot of attention to are paid ads and conversations about Russian interference and the volume of ads that they purchase. And I think it's very important to appreciate that paid advertisements are only a very small portion of this overall problem. They're quite cheap, and it's really a tactic to draw attention to organic content, to pages that people aren't paying to create. And it's an important distinction because in a society that values free speech, we do have a legal and regulatory framework for addressing paid political advertisements, but organic content, which is really the bulk of the problem, is not something that we really know how to manage. And then the last point is around, and this is fascinating, this just came out maybe a couple weeks ago, on who is sharing fake news, quote unquote. And something like 0.1% of the population is sharing 81% of fake news stories. And that 0.1% tends to be predominantly Caucasian, male, over 65, and somewhat more conservative. And so, again, it really depends on how you define fake news and if it's just the Pope endorsing Trump, or if you take a broader conception of it to think about uncivil content and inaccurate content. But I think that this last point really underscores how important it is to really understand the problem before moving towards the solutions, because if it's a 65 and over male population has really different implications for media literacy, for example. So then the last point that I wanted to bring up was around engagement with disinformation. So it may be that there's a fair amount of this content out there, but are people actually, and people are exposed to it, that is it actually changing their beliefs and their political behaviors? One study from about a year and a half ago at Stanford found that only 8% of readers actually believed fake news stories. So it may be that a lot of this content is preaching to the choir. But then again, you run into this problem of how are they defining fake news if it's just the Pope endorsed Trump versus broader conceptions of it. But there is this important question, I think, of how much of this content is preaching to the choir versus actually influencing beliefs and actions. On the action side, though, I mean, there's no question that came out in the professional testimony that Russians organized something like 60 events on U.S. soil, albeit these weren't terribly well attended events. But there's also evidence that I think there's direct evidence of WhatsApp contributing to 69 incidences of violence in India. Of course, we've heard about Pizzagate and Charlottesville and other instances where social media played a role. So I think there's really no question that this is in some ways contributing to political behaviors in the offline world. And then, of course, there are all the concerns around inaction and voter suppression, and some recent studies that have come out showing that significant multi-percentage points declines in African-American voter turnout in Ohio and in other places. The extent to which you can attribute that to social media is not totally clear, but areas where there was significant targeting of these populations, you also saw some declines in voter turnout. So I think overall, there's a need to really understand this problem much better before moving to solutions. And and I'm realizing that this slide did not move over, but so this is where I am ending. That there is a lot of evidence of significant but really targeted exposure to this content, but it also influencing people's offline behaviors and beliefs. So we're continuing to support a lot of research here, and I think I know that Jenny has been looking at interventions in the journalism space, and Talia at platforms, and then we've also been doing a lot of mapping to just really try, because it's such a new field, to try and get our arms around who is doing what in this space. And so at the end of the conversation, Kristen, if we have time, I'll come back and show 1 or 2 slides on how RAND and others are helping to map. I think the tool will be launched next month, helping to map who are all the different actors in this space, which I think will be a really helpful tool for funders. But I'll stop there.
Great. And maybe even if we don't have time to get to that in the discussion today, maybe we could make those slides available to folks after, because we do commit to following up with a link to the video recording, as well as the slide decks that are being shown and the links shared in the chat box as well. Kelly, there is one question that came in for you in the Q&A box. So a plug to submit questions in the Q&A box, because we are going to take them. And it's really on this point that you're making about how disinformation online is in fact translating to offline behaviors. And this question is really kind of the offline behaviors of whom. So Angela asks, I'm wondering if there's any research or what we know about how decision makers, like legislators and public officials, are using social media in their decision making, or is it more on the kind of consumer general buzz of the citizenry? So is it influencing kind of consumer level and citizen level decisions? Or is there evidence that disinformation is actually contributing to bad decision making by the part of people in power as well?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. There have been relatively few studies, primarily because it's very hard to get access to politicians, and even harder than once you have access for them to confess that they have been victims of disinformation. There are some cases, like Reuters came out with one recently, where there was a politician in Pakistan who had actually escalated nuclear threats between their relationship with Iran based on disinformation, and that was sort of later proven that that was the source of that escalation. So there certainly are instances of that, but it's almost impossible to do like a wide-ranging survey of politicians.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Jenny now, and then hopefully we'll have time for another question, because I'm resonating with Kelly's point that we do need to spend a little bit more time unpacking the problems to get to the solutions, which is what Talia, and I apologize, Jenny let me know that I accidentally mispronounced your name earlier. I'm so sorry. But that's what Talia is going to help us get into as well. But first, Jenny, let's turn to you. As Kelly mentioned, you have been doing a lot on the journalism side and have a background in journalism. So you think a lot about journalism's relationship with engagement and public trust. And so the lack of public trust in our democratic institutions, and even in some cases, the very idea of democracy itself, is continuing to grow. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to how you've witnessed this distrust manifest and what you think that it means for journalism.
So thank you so much. And I love being sandwiched in between Kelly, who gave this robust, awesome presentation, so I don't have to do as much work around the details. And then Talia, who's got all the research to correct all the wrong things that I'm about to say. I just love being sandwiched in, between two rock stars. So thank you for inviting me and placing me just in the middle. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some of the visuals to frame some of the work that I'm hoping to kind of present to y'all. Let's see. So I'm at the Newmark School, but I want to give some context for y'all around the work that I've done in civic engagement and journalism. I'm from Chicago, and when I started doing this work around journalism's role in the broader ecosystem of healthy communities, I specifically, first of all, I realized that if we were going to talk about trust and the decline of trust in institutions, namely journalism, where were the areas of opportunity to rebuild trust? And local, honestly, and I'm going to come back to that in a bit, but local seemed the most visceral. And when we see, for example, Pew studies around the decline of trust in journalism, especially from a local landscape, and studies that we'd seen in Illinois, that local journalism trust was a lot higher than in national surveys. So we did a deep dive. So I have a colleague also on the line who's at PACE now, Janice Lombardo, and Sean Healy and I at the McCormick Foundation in Chicago did kind of a big picture strategy on democracy, especially local democracies, and building trust. And we really focused on something called the Civic Empowerment Gap. And we were trying to think, if communities in Chicago and residents in Chicago felt like the local government was corrupt and fixed, if the most powerful incentive in actually engaging civically was one's sense of personal efficacy, for example, one sense of the ability to change something larger than themselves, that we're going to have to figure out the critical information and access to power attached to civic power attached to critical information, how that's disseminated to get communities engaged. So we were looking at the maps, and if you look at this, sorry it's so tiny, it's color coded. There's 77 communities in Chicago, and if you examine the different regions of disinvestment and disenfranchised communities, we really targeted the south and west sides of Chicago. Unsurprisingly, we also saw that the news and information deserts also were the south and west side communities. So if you attach that to socioeconomic statuses of these communities, news information deserts, thereby affecting the community to also civically engage, or what is the self-efficacy indicator of the citizens that live there or the residents that live there, you would, again, see how that kind of was a vicious cycle in terms of disinvested communities. pursue, let's see, how do I move this? Sorry, guys. Okay, so when I moved away from Chicago, well, let me talk a little bit more about the 2016 presidential election. So at the McCormick Foundation in Chicago, I convened a small group of both local and national journalism funders, and I happened to schedule it the day after the 2016 presidential election. And we weren't thinking really, I mean, we were going to talk about Chicago, but I have to say that day, we were just kind of looking at each other as journalism funders and quite frankly, mainstream news organizations, just kind of shell-shocked. And it wasn't so much maybe the outcome as it was our surprise. And I think what I realized was that, you know, I was wondering how we were so off. I think a lot of us were asking each other that. And I had done a tour of mainstream news organizations shortly thereafter as well, including the New York Times. And I remember all of us were just kind of like, how are we so off? And so how did we become so out of touch with the communities that we're serving? And, you know, fast forward a year later, we have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I put them side by side because to Kelly and Kristen's points earlier, they are using these social media platforms to speak to the audiences, but they're also very resonant with audiences, I think probably for different reasons, but I would argue that probably a lot of the public like both, that pay attention to what both are saying for different reasons. And I say the president and AOC. So I was kind of curious if they are using these, if these public officials are changing the ways in which they are resonant with audiences and community interests, and they seem to kind of be way more accessible in new ways that the public has been waiting for. What is the role of journalism in all of that? And why haven't we been able to kind of get in front of how our public officials have been able to talk to our communities? So when I think about media, and mainstream media especially, I feel like we have these two paradigms, basically. It's the polished newsroom, and I'm using this photo of Anchorman Burgundy for a reason, because it's ridiculous. Sometimes, you know, we look at, for example, broadcast or cable news, and it's kind of ridiculous. And I feel like a lot of regular people, for lack of a better word, think like we look ridiculous. But also when we think about community media and public media, this is, you know, an unsophisticated paradigm of like boring, you know, no business models, etc. And it doesn't have to be these two kinds of models, but these are the models that we've programmed ourselves that these are the two options, or these are the kinds of options that mainstream media or local media or community media look like. So how have we been able to pursue or create the change that we want to see that inspires us? It doesn't have to be any of those staid or outdated or out of touch, unsophisticated journalism models. How are we actually, as journalists or journalism organizations as an institution, take agency and really establish a new voice? How do we really inspire ourselves for a new world that is extraordinary? And I know that I get a lot of pushback in this work, and this is kind of the work that I'm trying to pursue at the Newmark School now, is, you know, what does that look like? How do we source better as funders, but also as journalism leaders and influencers? And how do we create the next generation for next generation journalism leaders for next generation audiences to play in this world of AOC and Trump and the social media platforms that we have as tools? Well, here's some examples. So as I was talking about the Chicago example and civic journalism, City Bureau was a new model that came out of that work. And as you can see, beautiful faces, doing awesome things with community. And also there is a group called Advocates for Inclusion in Media that are doing the same thing on the East Coast and West Coast, and they're trying to also scale. So I guess my point is that it's happening. We just have to kind of embrace and elevate it and challenge our own paradigms of what establishment norms are for traditional media, and create new models that inspire people. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny. And that piece on new models, whether you're adapting kind of older or traditional infrastructure or creating new infrastructure to do this work, was a big theme that came out of the last webinar that Media Impact Funders and PACE put on. So that's a great way to link those conversations together. Reminder to submit questions in the Q&A box. And because we're going to have hopefully plenty of time to get to those. But I want to shift us a little bit from the idea of problems to, which is super important to take the time to understand, but we don't want to be so focused on problems that we're not also lifting up and thinking about some of the solutions. So with that, I'd love to turn to Talia and ask you how you and some of your colleagues have been thinking about some of the solutions to the challenges of misinformation and disinformation that Kelly raised, and kind of some of the trust and engagement questions that Jenny helped us bring into the conversation as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and truly fantastic to be on a call with Kelly and Jenny, because they just have wonderful insights. So I think that a big crux of the reason that there's so much conflict and so much need for more research in this area is twofold. I think the first is we have this tacit assumption that business goals and democratic goals conflict with one another. That if a company, whether it's a media organization or a platform, is going to do something, that if it's pro-business, it necessarily will be against our democratic desires. And that's fair for some cases, right? There are things that you would do that would have a business implication that wouldn't have a good democratic goal, like a clickbait headline or something like that. But I think that it's really important that we challenge this notion. It doesn't have to be the case that business and democratic goals conflict, particularly if you take a long view, wanting society to function well, business and democratic goals can be quite aligned. And so I think that's really important. And then the second reason that I think it's important that we think about this is that testing every single intervention or idea we might have is incredibly important. So not everything works. There was a recent study that came out where the idea was, okay, on social media, people tend to follow others that are like them. And this is part of the problem because it allows polarization to happen and fake news to circulate. And so what if we just had people follow the other side? Then wouldn't that absolve some of these problems? And when the researchers did this, they found that it in fact led people to be more politically polarized. So I think this underscores the real need for evaluating solutions. Just because you think one might work doesn't mean that it will. So from the research that's been done, I want to share just a couple of thoughts and ideas on the types of research projects that we found where things do seem to be making some sort of an effect. And I'm arranging them in three sort of buckets. So the first one being that people really matter, the second one that affordances matter, and the third one that words matter. So in terms of people matters, there have been so many really exciting innovations thinking about how you can bring people together across lines of difference, or how you can make people feel included and represented in their media environment. And so I'll highlight just a couple of these for you. The first is we did a deep research project where we were looking at what have news organizations tried to do to bring people together, and then what have academics learned about best practices for doing this. So if you have really polarized groups, are there ways to bring them together so they can at least appreciate a different point of view? And so we did this work and found all sorts of really exciting examples of news organizations trying to do this. One of my favorite examples is KUOW did this feature called Ask a Trump Voter, and it was like a speed dating sort of situation where people could come and feel free to just ask questions because they wanted to understand the other side. And that one showed a lot of success, and I thought that was really interesting. And then others have been actually using the platforms in ways to try to encourage people to think across lines of difference. I'm thinking about some of the work that Spaceship Media has done by getting people from different walks of life to talk to one another in Facebook groups. So that's one instance in which people, news organizations, and platforms can bring people together in ways that try to reduce some of the polarization that we see out there and hopefully make it less likely that fake news might circulate because they're developing an appreciation for a different view. Another way of thinking about this is comment sections on news organization sites are one of these areas where everyone just kind of goes, oh gosh, what are we going to do? And news organizations have been really experimenting about how do we create better environments here so that citizens can have productive dialogues. And from our own research, we found a couple of different things can help to improve the dialogue there and make it more civil and help people to appreciate other views. And that includes a journalist getting involved in the comment section. So merely acknowledging that you're a journalist and that you place enough value on this space to say something to the audience there can be effective. Also highlighting top comments, so you're actually normatively signaling this is what a good comment is in this space, can be helpful to creating more spaces online. So those are a couple of examples of people mattering. Affordances mattering is a really interesting and exciting space that I think transcends whether we're talking about news organizations or platforms. And by affordances, this is a word that for a long time I didn't really like at all, but now I find myself using it. And basically what the academic literature means when they talk about affordances are what are the tools and things that are available on a particular social media platform. So a like button on Facebook. And the research shows that these can actually really make a difference. So Facebook a few years back had the opportunity for you to indicate that you voted on the top of your newsfeed. And the academic researchers who evaluated that demonstrated that if you participated in that or saw that even, you were in fact more likely to turn out to vote. So that's an incredible opportunity to work with platforms for social good and really positive democratic outcomes. Research shows that the design of those spaces really, really matters. So if you create a space that makes people think that they can say any casual thing that might be hurtful to another person, but that's okay in that space, they'll do it. If you create an architecture that emphasizes respectful conversation, you won't cure it. There's no cure-all for these sorts of things, but you can make it a better, more productive space. And there's been all sorts of looking at what sort of affordances matter. In our own research, just one small example in thinking about toxicity and those sorts of things online. The New York Times underwent a really massive redesign to their comment sections in the early 2010s. And we looked at what happened with people's behavior before and after that design change. And we noticed that people were using the abuse flag less, which we were thinking to ourselves, oh, well, that could be interesting. Maybe they figured out some great thing about design that could make civility go up, and then people aren't using the abuse flag. And we came to realize that they, in fact, made it harder to find the abuse flag. So it was more difficult to find. So it isn't as though they had some cure-all. They just made it more challenging to report problematic behavior, which I think shows how important the design is. And I think the platforms are also thinking about this, like how do you have people indicate that something is fake news? And I think the need for research to really document what works and what doesn't is incredibly paramount. Other examples of affordances, Yif Lelkish at the University of Pennsylvania has been doing this really interesting research looking at what happened when Twitter changed the number of characters that you were allowed to have in your tweet. And he's showing that as Twitter allowed more characters, people were leaving much more substantive comments as a consequence of that change. So I think this is another demonstration that these seemingly small design components can have really massive effects. I'll just mention too that Nate Persley has done some really interesting thinking about this, suggesting that platforms should think about deleting or demoting content. They should disclose where the content came from or delay its publication to try to curb the problematic content that's taking place here. And one other just quick comment on affordances. We've been doing a little bit of research on how Facebook allows you to indicate that news is fake. And it turns out that that's really tricky. So for a while, they were trying to flag things and say disputed by third-party fact checkers. Now they've moved to a related articles model. And from our research, what we're finding is that that actually doesn't work for all people. So it seems as though it's more effective among some groups compared to others. And it seems particularly tricky to affect the beliefs of Republicans for reasons that they're less trusting of fact-checking organizations, which represents such a major problem that this is not just design, it's the intersection of people and design that really needs to be attended to. And then final one is words matter. And what I mean by this is the way in which we construct our statements, in fact, needs to be tested. So two doctoral students here, Emily Van Doon and Jessica Collier, did this really fascinating project where they were telling people about fake news and then afterward asking them to evaluate articles as to whether they were real or fake. And what they found is that when they told people about fake news, just anything, even really mentioning the word, led people to think real news was fake, more so than if you had never heard of fake news before. So I think this is a message to all of us that even our vocabulary and talking about fake news could in fact have the effect of making the public less likely to think real news is real. And then a final words matter, and this is just one of those projects, we did it a few years back, but I love it so much, where we just evaluated, if you change the like button to respect in comment sections, does it change the way people behave? And what we were able to show is that just by changing that wording, people were more likely to respect a button or to respect a comment against their partisanship than they were to like it. And this is now in use on 18 different news sites. We're super excited about that. And I think it just shows, A, research matters, B, there are solutions, but it's going to take a lot of small interventions. There's not going to be one study that's like, oh, we just do this and it'll all be fixed. And then C, I think just re-emphasizing it's people, affordances, and words, and really testing those out that matters.
Mm-hmm. Talia, there's so much to unpack from what you just said, but I think one of the core things to me that I wrote down was it's not just design, it's the intersection of people and design, and how our various different lived experiences and frame of references and biases play into some of these things is something that's so important to understand, especially from a cognitive and behavioral perspective. We can't just think about these things as technical solutions to technical challenges. They're really things that have a lot to unpack. Speaking of unpacking, we're going to open up for questions now, and we've gotten a couple of questions or comments that some of the terms that we've been using are not super familiar to folks. And so I wonder if any of you, and Kelly, I'm looking at you in particular right now because I feel like Hewlett did something on this. Are there sources that you could point to that are any sort of like glossary or taxonomy of, you know, especially in the spirit of words mattering, about how we're differentiating between media and journalism and entertainment, or how you differentiate between what is misinformation and what is disinformation? Because all of these things have kind of a distinct nuance, but sometimes it can be easy to conflate them and use them interchangeably in ways that might actually make it harder for us to understand the problems and therein identify solutions. So I guess it's a two-part question. One is, do you know of any glossaries or taxonomies that we could share in the chat section to link to help people understand the differences? And two is, how do you all think about the nuances between some of these things that can feel interchangeable or synonymous sometimes, but aren't necessarily?
Yeah, so I'll take them in that order. So in terms of, there isn't a distinct field here yet. So these definitions exist and sort of indexes, but not in one aggregated place that would span media, journalism, internet, and democracy. Just in sort of online disinformation, I will send that out. We commissioned a literature review, and in that put together a glossary of terms, but this gets into bots and trolls and things like that as well that aren't as much to do with traditional journalism. In terms of the sort of generally understood distinctions in terminology about kinds of disinformation, there are two sources. The one that I most commonly use is just the distinction between disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. Disinformation is intentionally shared, inaccurate information. Misinformation is inaccurate, but the person sharing it didn't realize it, so it's unintentional. So it's a distinction in intent. And then propaganda is a politically motivated, often state-sponsored component of disinformation. So intentionally shared, inaccurate, and politically relevant versus relevant to health or some other thing. A more elaborate taxonomy that gets into different kinds of disinformation, and whether it's the context that's inaccurate, the entire premise, the author is inauthentic, came out from First Draft and Claire Wardle. And so if you looked, I can pull that up now actually, and I'll tweet it out or chat it out or whatever.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Jenny and Talia, any resources that you would point to, or any advice on how you distinguish some of these terms or think about them differently? Oh, and Talia just included a whole bunch in the chat box. So if you're not following the chat box, you might want to look at that. But then again, we will make sure that we send them out to everyone after the call as well.
Sounds good. So I was just going to second the Claire Wardle from First Draft comment, or as a resource. Claire has done really great taxonomy work because I was also very new to a lot of this work. And I think especially with Talia's and Kelly's presentations, I think you see in this new environment, it wasn't enough just to be a civic engagement expert or just a journalism expert or social media platforms. We're also learning about human behavior and how human behavior science or consumer psychology fall into all of these pieces as well. So it's really important to look at these things cross sector-wise.
I would third Claire Wardle, and also Kelly has written just some fantastic posts about this topic, and the literature review that she just posted in the chat, or someone just posted in the chat, is a really helpful introduction and overview.
Great. And Jenny, just picking up on one of the themes that you started talking about, really the thing that PACE was trying to advance with the idea of this Infogagement paper was that civic practitioners working alone is not enough, journalists working alone is not enough, technology working alone is not enough, that really there are some profound opportunities for collaboration across those sectors. And some of the organizations that you lifted up, like City Bureau, who was also a contributor, Daryl Holliday was also a contributor to the paper, and Jennifer Brandell at Harkin, have some really great models for what some of that type of cross-disciplinary collaboration and engagement can look like. All right, let me pull up my Q&A box again because there's a little one in it. It's for Talia. I'm wondering if there were any findings that didn't fit neatly within your three categories of people, affordances, and content. In particular, I'm thinking about the organization and governance and incentive structures within our institutions. Might these also have a role to play? And that's from Brian.
Yes, completely fair. There are lots of things that don't fit in my three buckets. And I think, thinking about governance and how organizations regulate themselves internally is really valuable. We're working on a project with Eli Pariser and Amidyar Network and Democracy Fund, where we're looking at what are the social values that social media organizations should try to promote. And that's been a really fascinating project because internally, a lot of the social media platforms have some ideas about what it is that they want to bring to the world. They're not super formalized, and right now there's so much attention to what's going wrong that I hope we don't lose sight of some of these positive things as well. So I think thinking about internal organizational structures and kind of values or principles is incredibly important. And then regulation is yet another piece that is incredibly relevant to this line of work. And Nate personally has been doing some interesting thinking there. So I would definitely recommend looking at some of his work.
That makes me think of some, I believe it was polling data that the Knight Foundation just put out too around public support for regulation of various media and technology platforms. So perhaps we can include that in the chat link as well. The Q&A box is empty, so I encourage folks to get in because we still have about 10 minutes for discussion. I'm going to take moderator privilege and bring a question into the discussion, which is, Kelly, you work at a foundation. Jenny, you have foundation experience. What's the role of philanthropy in this? And what do you think are, kind of conceptually or intellectually, how should funders be engaging in this type of work? And what do you think are the greatest opportunities for funders to make the most high impact investments right now?
Kelly.
Okay, I'll jump in. So I actually just posted an article on the link, the one that is called The Future of Truth, where I sort of explored this early on and spent some time looking at what is the philanthropic, what are all the different kinds of activities that government, philanthropy, civil society, and the platforms are supporting to try and address the problem, and found that they really fell and I think we talked about this in one other webinar maybe a year or two ago, but into three main buckets, which I sort of framed as on the production, distribution, or consumption side. So looking sort of upstream on the production side, a lot of efforts to improve the quality of journalism, journalistic revenue models, audience engagement, newsroom diversity, things of that nature, which I think are extremely important. And I came to believe that, you know, even when you do have great quality content out there, and take climate change, or there are a number of areas where it can just get drowned out in a sea of noise and sort of disinformation. So necessary, but not sufficient. And then on the sort of downstream side, the consumption side, a lot of different audience-facing efforts. You know, Choi mentioned some of the fact-checking stuff, news literacy, efforts to expose people to news from different ideological vantage points. And I think for different audience segments, and Talia, you mentioned the distinctions between liberals and conservatives. For some segments, that can work. I think a lot of the behavioral science has suggested that given what we know about motivated reasoning and confirmation bias and just how generally lazy most of us are, you know, that often doesn't really work. And ditto, you know, that opportunities for some segments in news literacy, but also, you know, we can only get about half of Americans to vote in a presidential election. So the idea that, like, many of us are going to sit down and do deep horizontal diligence into the sources behind a media outlet, I think it's also, if we put all of our eggs in the citizen-facing basket, I think we would be in a challenging spot. So we have really focused on platforms, and there, if you want, I can share. Basically, we've been working on two projects that I think, so basically funding research is what we think is most critical at this point, because of a fear that we're going to end up solving the problem in the wrong ways that actually damage free speech or have other unintended consequences. So I think research is most important at this point. There are also a lot of actual efforts towards intervention, and RAND is working on a project right now to map all of these different projects in a digital tool that will be live and constantly updated. I've been working with Claire Wardle and Jennifer Cavanaugh at RAND to develop that. I have a slide on it if people are to see it, but it basically starts to break down all of the civil society interventions, and we've developed about 10 categories. So people, if you don't want to support research and you want to support actual real world experiments, that tool will be live in March, and I'm happy to share it with this group. Things around authentication efforts, blockchain to establish origination of content, bot detection tools, credibility scoring, disinformation mapping, whitelisting of different approved credible groups, crowdsourcing of different kinds. So there's a whole taxonomy, and we've so far identified about 120 nonprofits, or a couple for-profits like NewsGuard, other civil society groups that are trying to address online disinformation. And so I think that tool, when we designed it, is for funders to better understand the opportunities.
And just to dovetail on Kelly's response, I think that, you know, similarly to the problem that a lot of newsrooms are facing from a business standpoint as capacity dwindles and resources dwindle, we're also faced with this question of sourcing and not having enough time to really do the research needed to listen to communities or find new voices. Similarly, in the journalism funders field, the way that the public is kind of wringing their hands on and frustrated with the journalism industry, I think journalism funders also face a lot of that pressure because there aren't very many journalism funders. I mean, I can count them probably on one hand to help subsidize or address these larger issues that for-profit and nonprofit journalism organizations are facing. So there's always this notion of, okay, well, and I appreciate everyone on this panel talking about there's no silver bullet approach. It's very complex. And part of this research that Kelly's talking about is for us to be a lot more nuanced and what Talia was saying, in the ways in which we want to fund solutions to some of these problems, but these root issues of these problems. And so I think what a lot of journalism funders are tasked now, and as an intermediary, the Newmark School has a few re-granting initiatives, and also are trying to provide some research and development kind of test cases to see which solutions might be scalable. But I think a lot of it, and Media Impact Funders and PACE is doing this, and I really appreciate that, bringing new funders to this issue that are cross-disciplinary for us to not just own journalism, because otherwise it does feel super overwhelming. And so to really get at these broader civic engagement issues from a bunch of different angles, I think feels more sustainable, and the collective decision making that happens in that space. I think the grants that happen out of that are just stronger and better.
Great. Thank you both. We have time for one more question, so I'm going to take this one from Abby because I think it's a great one. All of the questions have been great. Kelly pointed out that it's important to understand the problem in detail. I'm wondering what the panelists think about the dissonant research findings. Uh-oh, somebody clicked done and it went away. Sorry, let me get back to it because I want to read it accurately. The dissonant research findings about age and media literacy skills, particularly the ability to identify fake news. Some research shows that younger people are better at it, and some research shows that older people are better at it. And so obviously there's a lot of nuance to be discussed here, including what measures or indicators are used. And I wonder what you see as the most important to understand in this dynamic. Great question from Abby, and that'll be the last one, and then I'll move us to wrap up.
I think Talia, or I could say, my quick answer, and I know Talia, you might have different thoughts on this, but very often the discrepancies that we see in the research come from different definitions of the problem, right? And so some people say fake news as defined by these particular websites, and some people define anything that shows up on Breitbart as junk news, and others distinguish between different articles. Some may come from Reuters, and some are op-eds. And so the challenge that we run into again and again and again in this field, and something that we've really been working towards, is how do we start to standardize the definitions that we're using so you're actually comparing apples and oranges, because otherwise, if some people are talking about really uncivil content or biased content, or they're defining it at the level of the article or the author rather than the news outlet, you end up with these very confusing findings that we spend a lot of time trying to untangle.
Yeah, and I would just agree with that wholeheartedly. In the media literacy research out there are some articles that are showing, excuse me, who shares fake news the most. For instance, the recent article saying that older people share that more frequently. And then there are things that are looking at, do people know that HTTPS means it's a more secure website than HTTP, and younger people don't really appreciate the distinction as much, or something like that. And those are two totally different definitions, as Kelly was mentioning, of what media literacy is. So what I take away from those discrepant findings is all ages probably need some dose of this, and to need some increase in their media literacy. And there's something that all of us probably could learn. So that would be my takeaway.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone on the call. And thank you again to Media Impact Funders for creating the platform for this. So Nina, any final housekeeping or thoughts that you want to send us away with?
Just that if you have any questions at all about all of this material that we've covered today, which is a lot, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us. You can reach us at info@mediafunders.org. You can track us down on Twitter @mediafunders. You can visit us online at mediaimpactfunders.org. We're happy to answer any questions you may have, and we'll direct you to Kristen if you have questions for Kristen or any of our other panelists today. So thank you very much for joining us. Stay warm, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.